So welcome everybody. This is our Ariel Ministries Australia Life of Messiah meeting. Just for folks who haven't been at one of their meetings before, we run this meeting every Thursday night, and as soon as we finish the series, we go back and start it again. That's why some people in this class have been here 4 times. Either they're slow learners, or it's just that there's so much to learn in this Life of Messiah that they keep coming back. For those who have never been here before, what is it about? We're looking at Jesus in the Gospels, in the 4 Gospels. We know that it's first century Israel, and in first century Israel, the writers back then wrote things that they didn't have to explain what they were, because they all knew what they were talking about. But today, we don't know what they were talking about, so we need a bit of background information to it. And this is a series put together by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who is the founder of Ariel Ministries, and he's probably one of the most brilliant Bible teachers around at the moment. Just for some info, I'm going to shoot us right back to the beginning here, and I'm just going to show you some things that we just need to know. Just to let you know regarding the Gospels, we know that there are 4 Gospel writers. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In actual fact, the Gospels are not, some people say they're contradictory, but they're actually not. They're actually complementary, in fact. And just a quick overview of these 4 Gospel writers. Each of them has a different theme. And we're going to see, for instance, that Matthew, for instance, his theme is Jesus the Messiah, the King of the Jews. He writes to the Jewish people. His purpose is to explain and prove that Jesus indeed was the Messianic King. So he writes from that perspective. Then we go on to the other gospel writer, which is Mark. And Mark writes about Jesus, the servant of Jehovah. And that's why Mark uses a lot of things out of Isaiah. He writes to the Romans. And what are the Romans interested in? They're interested in the perfect servant. You give him a job, he does it, he comes back. Now, we have Luke. Luke writes about Jesus, the Son of Man. And he's focusing on the humanity of Jesus. What else is he writing about? He writes to the Greeks. And the Greeks have 2 main interests. First of all, they need to have accurate historical context. That's why most of our history today comes from the Greeks, because they recorded so many things. Also, in regard to that, the Greeks, they need to know about the ideal man. An ideal man to a Greek is a man who is very disciplined of mind, and he's disciplined of body. And Luke is writing to the Greeks to show to them that this man Jesus, in his humanity, he is that man. He's disciplined of mind, he's disciplined of body. And that's why we see the Olympic Games, for instance. They pit one man against the next to see who is the best man. Also, Luke is the only gospel writer who says in the first 3 or 4 verses of his gospel, he says, I write in order, which means that he writes in chronological order. So that's why Luke's gospel is the only one of the gospel writers who writes in chronological order. So if we will follow Luke's gospel all the way through, and what we will see is that we use a harmony of the gospels. And in the harmony of the gospels, for those of you who don't know what the harmony of the gospels is, the harmony is this. You should be able to see that. You can see that's the harmony of the Gospels here. It's one put out by Ariel. The harmony of the Gospels has all the Gospel writers together on one page. Sometimes you'll only have one Gospel writer because only one Gospel writer recorded something. But what this does, it gives us the opportunity to look at the story from each of the Gospel writers regarding that one particular incident or one particular discourse that Jesus had. And remember that each of the gospel writers will pick out things out of what Jesus says and does to apply to his theme. Now, we've covered the first three. Who else is there? There's John. What does John write about? Luke, he has three special areas of interest. And the three areas are, he writes a lot about Jerusalem. He writes a lot about the Gentiles and also women. Next, we have John, the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, John writes to his purpose of writing is to demonstrate or to show us that Jesus is the Son of God. And so he is the last gospel to be written. After the first three were written and were in circulation, John comes along after, and he writes to the church at large. He writes to the church, and his purpose, he has two sub-themes in his gospel. First of all, is a conflict between light and darkness. And secondly, he has the fact that Jesus came to reveal the Father. He came to reveal the Father to men. Okay, so in his gospel, he has three sets of sevens. He has 7 discourses. He has 7 I am statements. He has 7 signs. Okay, now that's the background. Now, John's gospel, over 90% of John's gospel is all new material. None of the other gospel writers wrote what John wrote. They already wrote their gospels. They're already out there in the public domain. And actually about 92% of John's writing is all brand new material. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background. And as I said before, briefly before, everything that Jesus said and did, these gospel writers, they would look at what he said and did, and they would simply pluck out this item for their gospel because it fits their theme. Whereas another gospel writer, he won't even want that. He'll pluck something else out. So we have each gospel writer will have some material which another gospel writer doesn't have, because he's writing to a theme and he's writing to a specific group of people. And so, for instance, we see in Mark's gospel, Mark uses the term straight away, forthwith, immediately. Why? Because Mark is writing to the Romans, and Romans want to know that a good servant gets his job, does the job, and comes back and says, yes, centurion, job done. And that's why he writes with the terms straight away, forthwith, immediately. Okay. Now we've come into this part way through this series, and simply because of the COVID-19 we can't meet anymore, so we put this on Zoom so that we can still meet on a Thursday night. Now let's get on to where we are actually going to be tonight. Oh, by the way, you'll see some squiggly things on your you'll see the squiggly thing with like number 1 next to it. What's that about? Well, that's the paragraph number, and that's the paragraphs that are in this Harmony of the Gospel. You see paragraph 101. So we're up to today to paragraph 113. Okay, this is where we are today. And what we see here in the previous section, which we did last week, a week before last, Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. And at that feast time, the leaders came to him and say, listen, you're not making yourself very clear. Are you the Messiah or are you not the Messiah? And, he said, virtually, he said, I have never hidden anything from you. And he made a statement. He said, I and the Father are one. And when he made that statement, they picked up stones to stone him. Why? Because because they recognized that he was making himself equal with God. So to say that he was obscure in what he had to say, there was no obscurity in that. He had declared himself to be equal with God the Father, and that's why they picked up stones to stone him. And so we see that he had to. One of the things was, he said to them, he says, listen, he says, the reason you guys have not believed in me, you have not understood what I was saying, is because he says, you're not my sheep. He said, my sheep hear my voice. So what Jesus was saying, he says that his sheep, you and I, we are his sheep. Why can we say we're his sheep? Because you and I have believed in him. We heard the good shepherd's voice. We responded to that voice. We are his sheep. But he was saying to the Jewish leadership and to the masses who at that time had rejected him also. Let me just take a step back. Jesus was rejected back in chapter 12 of Matthew's gospel, and he was offering the kingdom to them, and he was rejected on the basis that he was demon possessed. And at the time that he was rejected by the leadership of the day, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, or the Sanhedrin, at the time that he was rejected, he withdrew the offer of the kingdom. He was no longer offering the kingdom to the nation. He withdrew that offer. Prior to his rejection, he would do miracles simply to authenticate what he was saying. No faith was required. He would simply do a miracle on someone and to authenticate what he was saying, what his message was. After the rejection, miracles and signs, healings and things like that were on the basis of personal need and personal faith. Prior to his rejection, no faith required. He would simply heal the blind man. The blind man didn't even know who healed him till later on. He just healed him. Why? Because prior to his rejection, everything he said and did was, all the miracles and signs he did was to authenticate his message that he was proclaiming to the nation. He was proclaiming to the nation that I am the Messiah. After his rejection, everything changed. After his rejection, he only spoke to the masses in parables. And then he'd take his disciples to the side, explain the parables to them. Prior to his rejection, he would speak openly. They all understood what he was saying. After his rejection, he only healed on the basis of personal need. So you had to have a personal need and come to him, and you also had to demonstrate faith in him as the messianic person. So that's another main point. So we're going to get now into this section that we're in today, and what we know is, like I said, as we left from last time, he is at the feast of Hanukkah, the dedication of the temple, celebrating the dedication of the temple, and he has a bit of he has a stash there again with the leadership, and they take up stones to stone him because he declared himself to be the same, he and the Father to be one. And as I said before, it says that, you don't recognize me because you're not my sheep. Okay, so we're now coming into this section, and this section is the preparation of the disciples by the king. This is the new section we're entering into today, the preparation of the disciples by the king. And in this section, there are two basic motifs we're going to see in this section. First of all, we're going to see, and behold, there are last who shall be first, and there are the first who shall be last. We're going to see this in Luke chapter 13, verse 30. And the other motif we're going to see is that for everyone that exalts himself shall be humbled, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. We'll see that in Luke chapter 14, verse 11. Now, this section of Jesus's life covers a period of 3 to 4 months. It covers the period from the Feast of Dedication, which is around about the December the 25th, and we know it today as Hanukkah, and it goes from the Feast of Dedication in December AD 29 until the beginning of his journey to Jerusalem at Passover. So he's heading down to Jerusalem for Passover. Okay, we see here he now withdraws from Judah. And we see this in John chapter 10, verses 40 to 42. John chapter 10, verses 40 to 42. It says, and he went away again beyond the Jordan into the place where John was at the first baptizing. And there he abode. And many came unto him, and they said, John indeed did no sign, but all things whatsoever John spoke of this man were true. And many believed on him there. So Jesus goes beyond the Jordan to the area known as Perea, and this area is outside of the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, this was the religious rulership of Jerusalem or of Israel at that time. The Sanhedrin consisted of 71 members. We had one high priest. We had 24 chief priests. Now, they were all Sadducees, and the other 40, whatever it is, 47, 46 were all Pharisees and scribes, pretty much Pharisees. So this Sanhedrin, their jurisdiction was on the western side of the Jordan River. And across on the eastern side of the Jordan River, that's where Jesus is at this time, in a place called Perea, which is outside the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. And this was the place where John the Baptist primarily conducted his ministry. What for? He was preparing a people to accept the Messiah once he became known, once the Messiah became known. Remember, back in Malachi 3, first few verses, there was an unknown person coming who would declare the coming of the Messiah. And this was John the Baptist. So what we see here is that John the Baptist is preparing people, preparing those who have come to him, been baptized by him, preparing them so that when the Messiah made himself known, John would then point them to the Messiah and say, there is the Messiah. John's purpose was to prepare people to receive their Messiah once he became known. And we see here, by this time, incidentally, John has already been killed by Herod Antipas. And by this time, we see here that there was a lot of people who were changed by his ministry, because we see that he was very successful in his mission. Why? Because the text itself tells us, it says many came unto him. Many came unto Jesus. And they said, this is what they said about John. They said, John indeed did no sign, but everything that John spoke about this Messiah, this man Jesus, were true. And it says that many believed on him there. So these folk had heard John's preaching. Remember, he preached a back to God message. He preached a message, repent for the remission of your sins. Turn back to God. And they believed what he said about the coming Messiah. And at their baptism, they accepted. Once the Messiah, once John pointed at the Messiah, they were saying, by their baptism, they were saying, once John pointed out the Messiah, they would then follow the Messiah. That's why we see that in John, John's disciples were getting less, Jesus' disciples were getting more. Simply because John was simply the herald proclaiming the coming of the Messianic King. That was his job. So Jesus increases, John decreased. Okay, let's move on. Instructions concerning entrance into the kingdom. And this is in Luke chapter 13, verses 22 to 35. It says, and he went on his way, this is Jesus, he went on his way through cities and villages, teaching and journeying on to Jerusalem. I think I might have just forgot something here. Let me just go back here. No, okay. Okay, so what we see here is he went on his way, he's journeying on to Jerusalem, so he's moving down to Jerusalem, teaching all the way. This is toward his final journey to Jerusalem, and there he will begin the final week of his life. And on his way, he stayed in these places that the 70 disciples had prepared for him previously. And along the way, one of his disciples asked, Lord, are there few that are saved? Why did he ask that? Because in the previous section, back when he was at the temple, because of the rejection back then, because they followed their leaders, the masses followed what their leaders said. Their leaders said he's demon-possessed, and then the masses picked up on that, and they then declared that he was demon-possessed. So they themselves rejected him on that basis as well. So the context of this question is about entrance into the kingdom. And because of the context here, it is most probably referring to Israel's national salvation rather than to individual salvation. Okay, so what we see here is that Jesus shows us here, he answered, he says, listen, strive to enter in by the narrow door. For many, I say unto you, shall seek to enter in and shall not be able. We have seen previously that the Pharisaic way into the kingdom was the wide road, and Jesus dismissed this doctrine as false in the Sermon on the Mount. Let me give you some more information. According to Pharisaism, according to Pharisaic Judaism of the day, they said that all Israel would take the wide road and all Israel would have a share in the age to come. When we speak about the age to come in the Jewish frame of reference, there are two ages. It's the age that we're in today, and then the next age is the Messianic age, the Messianic kingdom. So they're saying that simply if you were simply a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that means you're a Jew, you had automatic entry into the kingdom. That's what they taught. However, Jesus pointed out that there is only a narrow door, and that is through him and him alone. And he's saying that they must strive to enter into the kingdom only by him, only through him. And he told them this, Jesus told them this, when once the master of the house is risen up, this is Luke 13:25, and has shut the door, and you begin to stand without and to knock at the door, saying, Lord, open to us. And he shall answer and say to you, I know you not where you are. Verse 26, then shall you begin to say, we did eat and drink in your presence, and you did teach in our streets. And he shall say, I tell you, I know not from where you are. Depart from me, all you workers of iniquity. Now, Jesus had been among them. They had eaten with him and they had fellowship with him, but just knowing about Jesus was and is today insufficient to enter the kingdom. So a time will come when the opportunity to enter the kingdom will be withdrawn. If an individual dies in unbelief, he will never enter the kingdom. Therefore, they must come to Jesus while you're alive, in this lifetime. And in Jesus's day, when he's saying this to them, what he's saying to them is, you need to turn to me in faith and believe that I am the Messianic King now. Why? Because the individuals of that generation had to come to him before the year AD 70. Why the year AD 70? Because Jesus prophesied, he prophesied that there would be not one stone left upon another on the temple. What he was saying was there was judgment passed upon that generation, and the judgment upon that generation was for the unpardonable sin of rejecting him on the basis that he was demon-possessed. That is the unpardonable sin. The unpardonable sin is a specific sin for that nation of that day. Nobody else can do that. And it is because while Jesus was physically present with them, they rejected him on the basis that all that he did was because he was demon-possessed. That's the unpardonable sin. It's unpardonable. It's a national sin. It is not an individual sin, because many Jews came to faith in Jesus after that. Paul, for instance, many others. Now, the judgment he passed upon that generation was going to come to fulfillment in AD 70. And in the AD 70 destruction by Rome, we had 1.1 million Jews killed and thousands taken away into captivity. So what he's saying is, you have got until AD 70, you have got until that time to turn to me. So when the Messianic kingdom is finally established at Jesus' second coming, the people who tried to enter by way of the Phariseeism of that day and the Phariseeism which is still going on today will find themselves excluded. They'll be excluded. Why? Because they believe even today that Israel will be saved. Why? Because we all have a share in the kingdom. That's not true. That's false. So he tells them, he told those Jews back then, he says, listen, there shall be weeping and the gnashing of teeth when you shall see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and yourselves cast forth without. That's in Luke 13:28. The patriarchs and the prophets will all enter the kingdom, but those who chose the wide road of Pharisaism will be excluded. Those, on the other hand, who chose the narrow door through Jesus are the ones who shall come from the east and the west and the north and the south, and they shall sit down in the kingdom of God. Luke 13:29. Who are these? These are the Gentiles who will enter the kingdom. The implication is very clear here. Many Jewish people will fail to enter into the kingdom, while many Gentiles will enter with the patriarchs and the prophets. In their own eyes, they were the first, but in God's eyes, they were actually the last. And the Gentiles would come and take their place and be first. So the motif for this section is there are last who shall be first, and there are first who shall be last. The first were the Jews of that day, the Jewish leadership and the nation of that day. They should have been the first ones into the kingdom, but they rejected him. Therefore, the Gentiles, when he went to the Gentiles after that, he rejected by the Jews, he then became a light to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles received him. And so they are the last who shall be first, and there are first who shall be last. So you and I were the last, but we are now the first. Okay. In that very hour, in the very hour that he's talking to these people, in that very hour, as Jesus was saying these things and speaking out against the false doctrine, there came certain Pharisees saying to him, "Get you out and go hence, for Herod would fain kill you." When was the last time we used fain? It's not my normal language. Herod would fain kill you. At first glance, at first reading, you'd think, wow, these Pharisees are so benevolent to Jesus. They're so kind as to warn Jesus that Herod Antipas was out to kill him, just as he'd previously killed John the Baptist. But as always, they had an ulterior motive. But what was that motive? Remember, the Pharisees, the religious leadership of Jesus' day, were constantly at odds with him. And again, for those who have joined for the first time, the reason for them being at odds with him, especially the Pharisees were at odds with Jesus. Why? Because the Pharisees had, and over the centuries, through the Sophir and the Sophrim, who were lawmakers, scribes, they had made they'd made thousands of man-made laws. It made thousands of man-made laws. And the Pharisees had pushed these man-made laws, and you will read in the Gospels, it talks about the oral law or the traditions of the elders. These are the man-made laws that the Sophir, the Sophrim, and the Tanaim, they made all these laws up. And they made these laws up for the purpose of protecting the Mosaic laws. Mosaic laws were 613 laws, and they said, listen, so that we don't go into captivity again, we need to build a fence around these Mosaic laws. And so they built this fence of all these other man-made laws, not God-given laws, man-made laws. And so Jesus and the Pharisees were constantly at odds with one another over these man-made laws. Jesus often went out of his way to break their man-made laws and so upset them. So we see these Pharisees coming to Jesus, and you would think, whoa, they're really nice to Jesus because they're warning him that Herod Antipas wants to kill him. Now, it's not so. They had an ulterior motive. Why? Because remember, he is currently on the east side of the Jordan. He's in Perea. And while he was in the east side of the Jordan, he was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great. And while he was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, he was outside of the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees, what they were doing is they were trying to get Jesus to cross over the Jordan, to cross over from the east side and from Perea to the west side of the Jordan. Why? Because once he's on the west side of the Jordan, he's now under the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin, and now they can arrest him, take him back to Jerusalem, and execute him. Now, Jesus gives a cryptic answer to these Pharisees in Luke 13, verse 32 to 33. He said unto them, Go and say to that fox, Behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I am perfected. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. So he's speaking in parable form here, and Jesus is here hinting at his resurrection. He told them not to worry, for he would eventually cross over to the west side of the Jordan. Jesus clearly showed here that Jesus knew he was heading to his death. Why? Because he says, For those in Jerusalem will kill him, not Herod Antipas. For it was not possible that the messianic prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. Jesus now closes with a lament. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that kills the prophets and stones them that are sent unto her. How often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her own brood under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And I say unto you, you shall not see me until you shall say, Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Their desolation is going to last until Israel as a nation say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. When Israel as a nation recognizes that Jesus has been sent from God, blessing will return. And this we find in Psalm 118, verse 26. And in fact, Jesus uses these very same words at the close of his public ministry in that last Passover. Now, we see Jesus going to be invited to a Pharisee's house for a meal. Sabbath day hospitality was a very important part of Jewish life. So it's not unusual for Jesus to be invited to a home for a meal after the weekly synagogue service. Sometimes the host invited him sincerely because he wanted to learn more of God's truth. But many times, Jesus was asked to dine only so his enemies could watch him and find something to criticize and condemn him for. And that was the case in the occasion we're going to see in Luke chapter 14, when a leader of the Pharisees invited Jesus to dinner. We see this in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6. And Jesus is teaching about true Sabbath rest here. So this incident occurred in the Pharisee's house, a Pharisee who invited Jesus over for a meal. And this time it was one of the rulers of the Pharisees who asked him to eat bread with him. And it came to pass, this is Luke 14:1, it came to pass when he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees on a Sabbath to eat bread, that they were watching him. He was a high Pharisee. What does that mean? It means that he was the head of a rabbinic school. So he was responsible for training up young men to become ordained rabbis. So what's happening? They're watching him. He and his fellow conspirators were again trying to trap Jesus in some way. Notice they were watching him. It wasn't that they were watching his table manners or things like that. They were hoping to catch him in transgressing another one of their rules. Now, the Pharisees also invited another man, And behold, there was before him a certain man that had the dropsy. And this is a medical condition called edema. And it means that this person suffered from an abnormal accumulation of fluid in one part of his body. I believe it's to do with the liver functions not working properly. And they were using this man as bait. Why? Because they placed him right in front of Jesus to try and trap him. And Jesus asked the Pharisees a question. And Jesus, answering, spoke unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? This is Luke 14, verse 3. But they held their peace, and he took him and healed him and let him go. They held their peace deliberately, avoiding answering his question. Now, according to Pharisaism, healing on the Sabbath was permissible if the illness endangered the person's life. If the person's life was not endangered, then healing on the Sabbath was not allowed. Remember, this was one of the man-made laws that they made up. Incidentally, God made Mosaic law had two laws regarding the Sabbath. The oral laws, they had over 1,500. Now, here, one of their laws was that if the person's life was not endangered, then healing on the Sabbath was not allowed. Edema was not life-threatening. So according to them, healing shouldn't have been done. But the point of Jesus's question was that Sabbath rest naturally included being healed. So when the Pharisees kept their silence and they didn't answer, Jesus then asked them another question. Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a well and will not straightway draw him up on the Sabbath day? That's verse 5. The obvious answer was that, of course they would do that. You know, my donkey is fallen into the well. I'm not going to leave him there just because it's the Sabbath day. I'm going to bring him out because I'm being merciful to my donkey. If doing good to animals on the Sabbath was okay, then doing good to fellow Israelites on the Sabbath should even be more appropriate. Therefore, Jesus takes the man, healed him, sent him on his way. And the result was that they could not answer again onto these things. Nothing Jesus said could be used to trap him. Now, he teaches a lesson on humility. And we see this in Luke 14, verses 7 to 11. And he spoke a parable unto those that were bidden. When he marked how they chose out the chief seats, saying unto them, when you are bidden of any man to a marriage feast, sit not down in the chief seat, lest haply a more honorable man than you be bidden of him. And he that bade you and him shall come and say to you, give this man place, and then you shall begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are bidden, go and sit down in the lowest place, that when he that has bidden you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then shall you have glory in the presence of all that sit at meat with you. For every one that exalts himself shall be humbled. He that humbles himself shall be exalted. So, Jesus addresses this parable to those who had been bidden to the dinner. This is the dinner that he was invited to trap him. His motives were not to try and trap anybody. Theirs were to try and trap him. So he presented this parable when he noticed that the Pharisees deliberately sought out the chief seats. Why? Because they were wanting to be noticed for their high standing and status in society. Why is this? Because in that time, in the New Testament time, the closer you sat to the host, the more attention you drew. But Jesus taught that a person should not elevate himself to a position of status. Rather, he should wait for others to recognize him. Those who elevate themselves to a higher position may actually be humiliated. Why? Because somebody else of higher standing may come into that dinner and you might be asked to step down. The principle for this section is, for everyone that exalts himself shall be humbled, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. That we see in verse 11 of chapter 14 of Luke. In respect to persons, he teaches another lesson. This is in verses 12 to 14 of Luke 14. And he said to him also that had bidden him, when you make a dinner or a supper, call not your friends, nor your brethren, nor your kinsmen, nor rich neighbors, lest haply they also bid you again, and a recompense be made to you. So Jesus addressed the host, and he said to him also that had bidden him. The principal lesson here is that hospitality demonstrates one's love for fellow men. So is the means of fulfilling the righteousness of the Mosaic law. By fulfilling this, you're fulfilling the righteousness of the law. However, a person who invites guests only to accumulate honor for himself and cannot expect to be rewarded, their hospitality was not an expression of love. It was not an expression of grace, but it was evidence of pride and selfishness. Their hospitality was self-seeking, self-glorifying, and self-righteous. They only invited people who could repay the compliment. The righteousness of the Mosaic law, however, demands that hospitality be extended to those who may never have the means to return the favor. So, we too should give to those who cannot repay. But when you make a feast, bid the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you shall be blessed, because I have nothing to recompense you, for you shall be recompensed in the resurrection of the just. We see that in verses 13 to 14 of Luke 14. Now, we see the rejection of the invitation. And this is found in Luke chapter 14, verses 15 to 24. The occasion of this section is spelt out in the following verse. And when one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he said unto him, Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Luke 14:15. The man who made this comment had just heard Jesus' teaching that those who served others shall be recompensed or compensated in the resurrection of the just. At the mention of the resurrection, he said, Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. So this led Jesus to tell the parable of the rejected invitation, also known as the parable of the Great Banquet. But he said unto him, verse 16, he said unto him, a certain man made a great supper, and he bade many. And he sent forth his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I've bought a field, and I must need goes out and see it. I pray you, have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray you, have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. And the servant came and told his lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor and maimed and blind and lame. The servant said, Lord, what you did command is done, and yet there is room. Jesus mentioned a certain man who had made a great supper. Verse 16. Those people bidden had already accepted the invitation, but when the dinner was ready, And the servant bid them come. Each of them excused themselves. They gave 3 different reasons. One man was too occupied with his material possessions. He said, I've bought a field and I need to go and see it. The second man was too occupied with his business. I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go to prove them. And the third man was too occupied with his own personal pleasure. I've married a wife. These shallow excuses incensed the master of the house. And he says to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and maimed and blind and lame. Since the higher class invitees would not come when bidden, the invitation was now extended to others who were needy. And when they came, there was still room for more. And the Lord said unto the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and constrain them to come in, that my house may be filled. Jesus concluded, for I say unto you that none of those men that were bidden shall taste of my supper. That's in verse 24 of Luke 14. We see the rejection of the invitation continued here. The beginning statement of this incident is key to understanding the parable. The man who back in verse 15 at the meal with Jesus, when he said, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. That man probably believed the Pharisaic teaching that all Israel will automatically have a share in the kingdom to come. He was confident that he would be in the kingdom feast. Now, the host of the feast in the parable was God himself. And those who prepared the feast were the prophets. The first servant sent out to declare that the supper was ready was John the Baptizer. And after him came Jesus. Those originally bidden, but who ultimately declined the invitation, were the Jewish leaders of that generation. The invitation was then extended to those in need, and the servant then found people both in the city and the highways and hedges. Luke verse 14, verse 21 and 23. The highways and hedges means the country. So those from the city represent the Jews who would come to believe and enjoy this feast. And those from the country represent the Gentiles who would also come and enjoy the feast. When Jesus said that none of those men that were bidden shall taste of my supper, in verse 24, he was pointing out that the generation which rejected the invitation would fail to see the kingdom at that time or in the age to come. Now, many today make the same mistake that these invited guests made. They reject the invitation because they think that they have the best now. But in actual fact, what they're doing is they're settling for second best. There was nothing wrong with owning a farm. There was nothing wrong with oxen or marriage. All fantastic things. They were good things. But these good things kept them from enjoying the best thing, which was the feast. The feast in the kingdom. Sitting down to bread in the kingdom with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the prophets. These rejected that invitation, and so too today. Many reject that invitation because they think that we are okay. We're happy like we are. We don't need that. Many today will reject the invitation of Jesus because they believe that they have a good life now. The problem is that once death comes, there is no second chance. One has to make that decision now to turn to Jesus Christ. Otherwise, they will miss out on the feast to come. And that, my friends, is the end of your lesson for today. We'll see you again next week And this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia saying shalom.